Hey everyone, this is Brian from the Tennis IQ podcast. Josh and I hope that you're enjoying the content and discussions that we put out week after week. If you would like to support the podcast and help us to continue to produce quality episodes, visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/tennisiqpodcast/membership. Currently, we have two tiers of support, $3 per month and $7 per month. So again, our Patreon page is patreon.com/tennisiqpodcast/membership. Thank you so much. And now, on to the show.
Hello and welcome to the Tennis IQ podcast. I'm Josh Berger.
And I'm Brian Lomax. And today our topic is going to be self-compassion. And the reason that we're discussing this today, or at least I'm really interested in going through this, because it's been a theme that I have been working with on a number of athletes. And it came about because I've been noticing a lot of, at least with these particular clients, a lot of negative self-talk. Which, if you think about it in a sport like tennis, and Josh, you and I have talked about this many times, when you're playing tennis, you're getting immediate and clear feedback on every single point. Whether you won the point, lost the point, hit a great shot, made a mistake, we're always stopping and getting this feedback, which can often lead to judgment, which, in a negative sense, none of us really likes negative outcomes of points, or we don't like negative emotions. We tend to avoid that kind of thing. And so what's the natural reaction? It can be negative. It can be critical. We can ask, why did you do that, etc. And with some of the players I've been working with, this type of self-talk, while I think at times is okay to engage with if you can move on and channel your energy into the next point and remain focused, but too much of it can really limit your ability to play your best tennis. And the more of it that you engage with, the more difficult it becomes to to be positive, to be optimistic, to keep fighting. In essence, I like this metaphor from Dr. Larry Lauer. He's the mental skills specialist with USTA Player Development. He talks about confidence as a well of water. I often like to use the Jenga tower, but I'll use his metaphor here. And every time that you say something negative, you're basically taking water out of your well. And your well would represent your confidence, your mental toughness, etc. And every time you do something more positive, you be kind to yourself, you're adding water in. So your confidence, your resilience, and so forth gets stronger. And he uses this on a like a continuum of confidence, from fragile confidence to resilient confidence. Fragile being, when something bad happens, you're easily knocked off. And I think what we're talking about here is how do we go from fragile confidence to resilient confidence to maybe even being fully anti-fragile, where no matter how much you throw us around, we're not going to break. And I feel like, self-compassion is an important topic to help us, traverse that continuum from being fragile with our confidence to being able to withstand things, being resilient, able to bounce back, but then getting to a place where we're not breakable at all. And we may never get there, but if we're looking at it as a continuum, I think that's a good place to start. So I guess, Josh, maybe to open this up to you to get us started is, as we're thinking about self-compassion, really it comes down to self-talk and that negative self-talk. What do you see with some of your clients in terms of how they're talking to themselves? Are you seeing also this negative type of self-talk, and how's it affecting them when they play?
Yeah, I think the negative self-talk is, I would say, the default. I think a lot of people, most people, in fact, nearly all people, have this default state of negative self-talk, of being really self-critical, of talking to ourselves in ways that we would never talk to a friend or a loved one in that same way. And, I think the reasons for why it happens are many, right? In a sport like tennis, or in other sports, it's just you out there, right? It's an individual sport. There's that instant feedback after every point. You've either won it or you've lost it. And it can be, there's constant moments of judgment. There's constant opportunities to judge yourself, to judge your performance, to compare yourself to the person on the other side of the net. And all of this can lead to people being very negative with their self-talk and being very critical about themselves. So I was glad when you mentioned this topic, because I think it is critical and it is foundational that tennis players embody more self-compassion in order to understand that the emotions that you feel in a tennis match are normal, to understand that the ups and downs and mistakes that take place are normal and happens to the best in the world, um, and to be able to, not lose faith and not lose um, your own, so sort of your own deeper sense of who you are out there, and I think through self-compassion we'll talk more about how to build that, what are some strategies. You can be more resilient and handle those ups and downs, and handle whether it's more on a micro level within a match, right? Ups and downs every point. Maybe you hold serve, and then you break, and then somebody breaks your serve, and then you lose a set, and then you come back and you win the next one. So those ups and downs within a match, but also longer term, right? Those ups and downs, over weeks or months or even years, right? And I think having that sort of inner fortress of self-compassion, you could say. I know we've talked about that from a mental toughness perspective, but having more of a deeper self-compassion that you've built over time can help with that resilience piece, can help you withstand those ups and downs, that turbulence that you're likely to encounter. And I think that there's, I think turbulence actually is an interesting way to think of it, and it's a topic that's been on my mind a little bit recently. I just took a very, very, very small plane, about a 10-person plane, including the pilot, literally 10 seats on a plane, um, and a very short flight, a 12-minute flight from Block Island, Rhode Island to Westerly, Rhode Island, for anyone in the Northeast who are familiar with this part of the country. And the reason why I was taking the plane is because all ferries off of the island were canceled because of extreme winds. So dealing with turbulence in general on a jumbo jet is one thing, and then when you're on a 10-seat, puddle jumper, it's a different story. So part of it is understanding that turbulence is normal, understanding that ups and downs and mistakes and slumps, this are all normal, but having the compassion, having the faith in yourself, in the situation, that you can figure it out, and that this passes. And I think and maybe this is jumping ahead a little bit, but practicing mindfulness, starting to be aware of thoughts and feelings, and noticing different aspects of our experience, you start to notice that sensations pass, whether they're thoughts, whether they're any of those other things that were mentioned, right? Feelings, other sorts of sensations, they pass. So understanding, okay, I'm in a match and I'm feeling a certain way, and I'm feeling really bad about myself because I'm really not playing well right now. Understanding this too shall pass, and I need to have that sort of perspective, and understand that like other sorts of experiences, like other sorts of sensations, this is fleeting, this will pass over time. And I need to sort of have that perspective of that self love and that self compassion, to help me withstand this moment.
I'm glad that earlier you brought up our inner fortress, right? We've used that, the inner fortress of mental toughness. I think you could make a strong argument that self-compassion would be one of the factors or components of mental toughness. You brought up the mindfulness piece. Let's go back just a little bit and define our terms. What does self-compassion actually mean? I'm going to give an academic definition of it, and then we can unpack that a little bit and talk about it from a tennis perspective. So This comes from probably the preeminent researcher in self compassion in Western society. It's Kristen Neff. She is a researcher, doctor at the University of Texas in Austin. And so let me read what her definition of self compassion is. So, self compassion involves relating to oneself with care and support when we suffer. Kristen defines self compassion as consisting of three central components: self kindness versus self judgment. Kind of touched on that a little bit already. Common humanity versus isolation. We all go through this stuff. And mindfulness versus over identification. So, kind of what you were talking about there, Josh. These things will pass. You don't have to let them stick to you and say that's part of who you are. Um, so, I think this is a good definition for us to unpack and now relate back to tennis. So the idea of being kind to yourself versus judging. Now, in Kristen Neff's research, one of the things that she brings up is that people who make mistakes, or people who are kind to themselves when they make mistakes, are more responsible in how they respond and more likely to look for solutions than the ones who are judging themselves. And they may even over identify with the mistakes. We've talked a bunch about self-image in our last few episodes and how we want to be identifying with the good stuff. Not everybody does that. A lot of people will create their self-image around what's going wrong, what they're not doing well. You're only as good as your self-image. If you have a self-image of making mistakes or being a loser or whatever, you're not going to get above that. So self-compassion not only helps us deal with those mistakes better, but can help us really, I think, create the kind of self-image that we want. Um, and as you said, Josh, the negative stuff is more or less the default. It's the easy emotion. Even when we get angry, just in general, that's the easy emotion. Now, with men, we have often said that, well, that's a sign of toughness. You see this in maybe other sports, like in football, like with coaches. We seem to forgive football coaches who lose their minds and go nuts and like, oh, well, they're just passionate, they're just tough, they're emotional. But it usually leads to poor decision out there. And I think that would be the same for tennis players. So, how can we not go to that default piece and understand that being kind to yourself, it's the tougher decision to do? It takes a lot of courage to be able to be kind to yourself, realize it's not being soft. But once you get there, what are you doing? You're actually being more of a realist, especially in a sport like tennis, where we can get very negative, yet aren't we still in the match? As we've discussed many times, you're never out of a tennis match. The only thing changing from point to point or game to game is probability. The probability of one player winning versus another, but it's never 100-0. There's no clock here. We have to finish. So you are never, ever out of it. And so we don't want to ever act as if we were out of it. And that's really hard. Maybe my saying that makes it sound so simple. But when you're going through this, use your word, Josh, turbulence of a match, it's not easy. And in fact, I said this before we started to record, I can really relate to this because as a younger player, extremely critical with my self-talk. And it really wasn't until much later that, when I started to value the next point as being the most important point, that I was able to accept what was happening and try to be more present with what was going on and to encourage myself to keep going out there. Um, we already have one opponent on the tennis court. Don't need another out there. And in essence, you're only helping your opponent in this process. So when you think about these three components, maybe not all of them will completely factor into a tennis match, although I think from a well-being perspective, they're all really good. So self-kindness versus self-judgment, our common humanity versus just us, just isolation, and mindfulness versus over identification. I'd love to get your thoughts on those components, Josh.
I think they're all important. I think that last piece, that mindfulness versus, over identification, that, when I think of mindfulness, I think of awareness first and foremost, being aware of everything that takes place within us, right? Our thoughts, our emotions, our feelings, our physical sensations, and everything that's going on around us as well. Um, and I think that also fits into this broader concept of tennis IQ that we've talked about, where it's sort of that awareness, that understanding of not just our side of the net, not just the other side of the net, but the broader match and the dynamics of a match. Um, so I think in order to play great tennis, in order to maximize your abilities, that awareness is a critical component. And especially when that's compared to over self-identification, um, I think part of part of that awareness, part of that mindfulness is understanding that mistakes don't define who you are. I think it can be easy to forget that the top players in the world um, make mistakes too. They miss overheads, they double fault, they make mistakes throughout the match. And we've talked about some of the statistics here, how over the course of a season, the best players in the world don't win 70, 80, 90% of their points. They win something closer to 55% of their points. They win just over 50% of their points over the course of a year. So I think it's a sign of maturity, it's a sign of progress when tennis players can get to that point of understanding that mistakes are part of the process. Days where you're not playing your best are part of the process, but being able to still fight and still try your best in those moments regardless, and not tank just because, hey, I don't have it today, I woke up in the wrong, I'm tired, I'm hungry, whatever the situation is. Okay, I guess it's not my day. you know I'll be back. I'll be back next weekend for the tournament. No, it's like, okay, I need to figure, this is the situation. I need to try to figure this out here. Part of tennis is being a problem solver, right? Generally, there's no coaching. There are instances where where there is, maybe it's in between that second and third set is, I think more common now, where, at the ATP level now, there's ATP and WTA now, there's, more instances of coaching, and we can talk about that. But in general, you have to be a problem solver out there. And part of being a good problem solver is not letting your emotions get in the way of sound judgment and sound decision making. And if you're so wrapped up in how you're playing on that particular day, or the fact that you're losing to somebody that maybe you don't feel like you should be, or you're just not content with your level or the situation, then it's really hard to be the best competitor you can be and problem solve and focus and try to find a way. So I think, long answer to your question, Brian, but of those three, that third piece is the one that I guess I feel has a particular importance.
And I want to build on that a little bit because what are we typically getting negative about? It's usually outcomes or performance, also known as things that are not fully within our control. So we're criticizing ourselves for things that we actually don't fully control. And that's problematic. If you were to criticize yourself for tanking or having a bad attitude, I would have a easier time accepting that because that is within your control. And I bring this up because 99% of us don't step on the court tanking, right? We're going out trying to win. That's our goal. We want to win. We're trying to play well. Our intentions are all positive. And so, to me, what is wrong with trying to play well and trying to win? Okay, it's not going to happen all the time, but you're trying to do the right thing. Why are we criticizing ourselves? Because it just didn't turn out right. This is a fighting sport. It's not going to happen for you all the time. As you mentioned, top players in the world make mistakes. Top players in the world lose 50-ish% of their points. Um, the stuff we can be critical of ourselves are our standards of excellence on the controllable items. If you're doing well on that, I think then you're winning the battle in many ways. That's what you can control. But what happens is we get negative about an outcome, and then it has an effect on our standards of excellence on controllable behaviors. And that is a critical um, issue for many players. We do not want your fight, your attitude, your effort, your footwork, your energy levels to be affected by the outcomes of points. Those things, as much as you can, you want them to be independent variables here from winning points, losing points, making mistakes, hitting winners. If we, but for too many of us, they're connected. If we're suffering a lot out on the court, these controllable behaviors tend to suffer and their level comes down lower. And what happens there? You're not fighting as much, so whether you believe it or not, you're kind of in the tanking response. You're not giving your full effort, and it's because you don't like the outcomes of points. So I think once we recognize, hey, that's what's going on, I really need to stay focused on my standards of excellence on these controllable behaviors and understand the flow of the match involves mistakes and lost points and the opponent hitting winners. I'm also going to hit some good shots. I'm going to win points. I'm going to hit my own winners. I'm going to force errors out there. These are normal things. And as long as I can talk myself through and keep my standards of excellence high, I have a chance to compete and go all the way to the end. So I think understanding that is important. I think also understanding that being kind to yourself is not soft. As I said earlier, it's actually harder to do. It's the more courageous decision, and it's also the right decision. Kristen Neff points this out in her research. There are no studies that show critical self-talk as a performance enhancer. Now, is it possible for some people to occasionally channel anger into something productive? Absolutely. But that's not the norm. And even those people can find anger to be a bit unpredictable at times. Many people will bring up the example of John McEnroe. It didn't always work for him. There were some matches where it spiraled out of control and even ended up in sometimes him being defaulted from a match, right? So that's a tough. I almost think of the anger as like a bucking bronco or a really like wild horse. It's it might take you where you want to go, and then again, it might not. And some people are a little bit better at that than not. So I want to make sure that we're understanding what this compassion idea is self-compassion. It's not soft to be kind to yourself, and I think in fact it's really necessary that we do it. And this is an ancient principle. When Kristen Neff started to do this work, I think her mission was to take this ancient principle from Buddhism and try to apply some empirical science and evidence to it. And she's done that. So if people are interested in looking that up, Neff is Neff. And she has I think her own website about self-compassion. So it's really interesting to look at. To come back to the mindfulness piece, Josh, because I think this is also a way of cultivating. Maybe we can start to talk about how we cultivate some of this a little bit more in players. So I recently went through a book called The Power of Mindfulness by Amy Baltzell and Joshua Summers, and they have a mindful meditation training system. And a big part of that system for them is helping athletes develop self-compassion for a lot of the reasons that we're talking about it. And one of the interventions that they're using is a particular type of meditation that I have personally found very powerful, and it's called loving kindness meditation. Now, this is another one that doesn't necessarily resonate as like being the tough guy kind of meditation. You may not like the name of it, but I would really encourage everyone to try this type of meditation. You can go to YouTube. There are many good examples out there on YouTube. Um, and what it does is it first of all helps you develop compassion for yourself. And it's a guided meditation, and whoever's guiding you will help you to understand how to have more compassion for yourself, how to wish yourself peace, and etc. But then, getting to the idea of common humanity, it broadens it to other people in your life, loved ones, and maybe even some people who are people you don't necessarily agree with all the time. Can you bring compassion to that? I found this super powerful, Josh, and I combined it with something from the book, The Four Agreements, which was one of those agreements is don't take anything personally. And I felt like this meditation, along with trying not to take things personally, really worked for me. And it allowed me to be more compassionate and empathetic with other people, but also to provide that for myself. And that was really helpful in my tennis as well, to be able to shift from somebody who was very critical on the court to someone who was more or less a pretty good coach and a good cheerleader.
I think that all makes sense, and I think you bring up a good point. So when it comes to loving kindness meditation or meta, this I think it's important. Yes, this can be about the people that you're close to, the people that you love, but also trying to think of it. I think it's interesting, trying to think of it towards people maybe that you don't feel as close with, or that you have certain disagreements or maybe even hostility
Or even your
towards,
opponents.
or your opponents. Absolutely, understanding that they're a part of that process of you of your journey as well. I mean, I think in today's society, and I think that maybe this is a bigger discussion, but people have gotten so divided on a lot of things, whether it's politics, whether it's so many different things. But if we can try to view each other through this lens, and view people with compassion. I actually think, and I don't think I've mentioned this at all on this podcast, but there's a really great speech by David Foster Wallace. This is Water. Um, and actually, David Foster Wallace was he passed away, but he was a huge he used to be a tennis player, I think at a pretty high level, and he wrote a lot about tennis too, including something where he very articulately, very um, he really went into a lot of detail about sort of the beauty and grace of Roger Federer. So you could certainly look that up as well. I think there's a whole book about different writings that he did on tennis. But anyways, in his speech, This Is Water, he talked about, you know, first of all, having the sort of presence to understand. I'm probably not going to do this justice, trying to sum up this speech. So I probably won't even try. But what I remember from one part that really resonated with me was talking about, different situations you might be in. Maybe you're in your car and you see somebody cut you off, and you're like, "Oh, that idiot," or like, "Oh, what a jerk." And it's like, okay, can we try to have compassion for that person? Who knows what situation they're in? Maybe they cut you off because there's somebody whose water just broke, and they're about to have a baby. Or maybe we're in the grocery store and somebody's being really rude to us. Can we maybe step out of ourselves for a second and have compassion for that person, understanding that they might be going through a tough time, or they may have had a tough day, or maybe have been delivered some sort of bad news, and maybe that's why they're acting a certain way, or they have a certain attitude on that day. So I think, and I would encourage all, everyone to listen to this. The This Is Water speech. It was at I think the Kenyon College graduation many years ago, maybe 15 years ago or so. But definitely worth listening to, and I think it relates to a lot of this. And it's important to have compassion for yourself, certainly, and understanding um, that you're human, that you make mistakes, that things happen, life goes on, but also the people around you, and also others in general, and understanding also that you having that sort of an outlook on life and on the people around you, on humanity in general, has a positive impact on you too. So even if it's purely for selfish reasons, that there's still benefits there. But just wanted to include that because I think it's a great speech, and relates to a lot of these concepts, relates a lot to mindfulness and being present, um, and having perspective. But I think particularly with this issue, it definitely connects.
I wanted to build on your story because that example of the car cutting off is often used with something like loving kindness meditation. And another way to think of it is that's just like me. We've probably all unintentionally maybe cut somebody off, or maybe we have also done some of those things that we're now upset about that somebody else is doing. And another way to look at it is, oh, hey, they're just like me. I've done that before. That can also help us to have more compassion with that. So I completely agree with you, Josh, and that is a great speech. People, we could maybe even link to it if we find like a online version of that. So that's one way we can start to build some compassion, not only for ourselves but for others. And I think that can, as you start to do that, you can look at your opponents perhaps in a different way. Yeah, we have tried to talk about looking at your opponents not as necessarily your enemy, but really your partner in creating a great performance. And your opponent is someone you need in order to improve, in order to play the match. It's rather boring if there's nobody on the other side. That doesn't give you much. So, but when your opponents do things out on the court, it's not necessarily personal. And like you were just saying with the idea of the car or being rude to somebody, that person may be going through a number of things in their lives that is leading to this behavior. Um, and maybe it's not. Maybe there are going to be times where that's just who they are. Maybe they've over-identified with certain things. But in general, people are doing the best that they can do in that moment. And if we can bring that kind of understanding to a tennis match, perhaps getting over a bad call becomes easier, or getting over like the behavior that we see around the court becomes easier. But if we bring this back to being compassionate with ourselves, I think really to me, the biggest reasons to do this, Josh, are to help us continue to stay focused on what's important. We often talk about what's important now. Negative self-talk will get us more rooted in the past, and we won't be in the moment as much. So we need it from that perspective. It keeps us in the match more, like working toward what we want to do, and be able to handle that roller coaster of emotions better. Um, and I think when we're thinking about making mistakes or about reviewing our mistakes and how we respond to those, self compassion can be much better at leading us to solutions. We've talked about the coaching voice here, right? Using your name and then coaching yourself through it. If you are stuck in negative self-talk and you're stuck in problem talk and not looking at solutions, you really can't invoke your coaching voice. And the coach that we're thinking about the most on the court really should be one who has your best interest in mind, is motivating, is accepting of you, understands you're giving your best effort out there, and can forgive errors and mistakes, knowing that the match will continue. So something to think about with respect to self-compassion is, if I were to create some adjectives for my coaching voice, what would those be? And I like to think of it as motivating, positive, productive, uh, encouraging, accepting, forgiving. So there are a lot of words that you want to work in there. That can help you then to develop that voice better. Positive sometimes is just a little bit too broad, but I think as you bring more adjectives, more granularity to what you're looking for, then it becomes easier to have some more intentional self-talk about how to approach, the whether you call it the suffering of playing a tennis match, because there's a lot of unpleasantness, but how you're handling the ups and downs of that.
Absolutely. I think I think that's really important, and it can be suffering. It can be suffering at times. It can be brutal. It can be painful. It can, you know, it can feel on our worst days, it can feel like, why am I even doing this? And I'm sure many people listening have had that feeling before. Um, but trying to connect to some sort of deeper meaning, trying to understand why am I doing this in the first place? What is that main reason? What are those few main reasons why I play? You know, is it the mastery component? Is it the sort of relatedness community um, component of those people I'm around? Is it something totally different? Is it the autonomy piece of, okay, I this is something that I choose, something that I enjoy. I get to choose, who I play and where I play. What are the situations? Do I play more singles or doubles? Maybe I enjoy more one or the other. Um, but I think having that deeper reason why you play can help with a lot of this. But I think, sort of going back to um, this topic of self-compassion and maybe um, ways to increase it, ways to improve it. Glad that you brought up, different meditations. I think that can definitely be helpful, and just building on a meditative practice, building on a practice of mindfulness, I think also can help with a lot of this. There's definitely journaling that can also be helpful here. And again, as you mentioned um, on Kristen Neff's website, selfcompassion.org, there are a lot of resources out there. Um, so, journaling can definitely be big, and we've talked about journaling being a good key towards increasing awareness in general, whether that's more bigger picture, it's sort of like a training journal and being able to look at that over time, or journaling about a particular match or particular experience. But there are a lot of resources out there, and I think you know, for the sort of that first piece is understanding that this is important, understanding that this is something that can help me, understanding sort of that nature that we have as people to often to often be critical, to often be not particularly compassionate to ourselves, and even at times the ones around us. So I think that can be a good starting point, and then starting to think about, what are the types of resources that I need, right? Whether it's those meditations, whether it's talking to somebody and being able to talk through certain things about yourself, whether it's working with a sports psychology professional or a therapist, or reading, certain things, or journaling. I think there's, a lot of resources out there, certainly, but that first step is understanding the importance of it.
Yeah, and I think also, we've recently been talking about some of the interpersonal aspects of performance and the performance team, and the self compassion in sport literature talks about one way of fostering this is making sure that coaches and parents are also promoting it and talking in self compassionate ways. And that is not always the case. So for parents and coaches who are listening, we want to, it can really begin with you. You can be modeling how to talk to the player and have compassion for them. I often, when I have those parent conversations, Josh, I will talk about what they're going through is really hard. We have to have empathy, and we have to encourage them to keep going. And I always mention encourage means to give courage to someone else. That's what we're doing. And it takes a lot of guts to play this sport. And because you're the only one, at least in singles, you're the only one out there. We know who's responsible. And um, it's not easy to do this sport. And so if we can have compassion from the coach and the parents to try to understand that that's actually going to help our players stay in the sport, enjoy it more, look to improve when they're ready to perhaps make a really serious run at being a great player, they'll be at the right place emotionally, mentally there. But the performance team has to have that that compassion. And I think when we look at how, say, Juan Carlos Ferrero talks about Carlos Alcaraz, I mean, just look at his demeanor in the player box. Very calm, but also you can see at times just sort of like giving him a little bit nod, like, yes, you got this, or a little bit of a clap. Nothing too emotional. And of course, maybe that's what Carlos needs. Every player in his or her box has to have an agreement of what I'm looking for from the box. And and that's what you see with Ferrero. You see the same with Nadal and his team. It's very encouraging, very positive. And just hearing Juan Carlos Ferrero talk about Carlos Alcaraz, it's just very thoughtful. Of course, because he's been through that process, hasn't he? He's been at the top of the game. So he knows how hard it is. Coaches and parents sometimes forget that. Sometimes looking too much at what's going wrong and what needs to be worked on and so forth. And we've got to bring it back to the understanding of, hey, this is a difficult journey. This is a difficult sport to master. When we had on Bill Tim, he's talked about in the past, it takes 5 years to learn all the requisite skills, and it takes another 10 years to become a champion. That means you're looking at anywhere between 10 and 15 years of lots of practice just to become a really, really great player. It's not going to happen at 13, 14, 15. There's so much more growth there. And I think the more that coaches and parents can understand that and bring empathy and compassion and encouragement to that process, that's going to help the player develop his or her self talk. And as you said, Josh, maybe get us all really centered on what's the real why here. And that's so important.
And no, absolutely. And I think understanding that tennis is a really difficult sport and having conversations like that with parents, understanding that, you know, a 13-year-old, right, probably is putting a lot of pressure on themselves, probably has some pressure from their coach, probably has some pressure from a parent or parents. Um, and understanding that it's tough. It's tough to be out there by yourself. It's tough to be out there for hours, oftentimes. Tough to be constantly comparing yourself to peers. And, I think it can be easy for parents to look at their 12, 13, 14-year-old and say, okay, well, I see some of these other kids and they seem to be further along. And understanding that everyone's on their own path, some people maybe excel at certain skills, mental, physical, emotional skills earlier than others, and that's okay. Um, but also understanding that, that it takes time. As Bill Tim said, it takes time to become a champion. It takes time to fully develop. I mean, especially at that age where, they're quite far from even, their brain being fully developed, right? So it's not we can't really expect somebody to have fully mastered all of these skills at that point. Maybe there are some people that are exceptional at some of these areas and have also done maybe a lot of work. Maybe they've worked with a sports psychology professional a lot more up to that point, or they've talked with their coach, or they maybe on some of these skills it's more innate, and they have more of an innate sense of emotional regulation, or a more of an innate sense of how to focus, or some of these different skills. But I think it can be very easy for people to compare themselves, for parents to compare their kids as well. So to treat them with compassion, but also with patience, understanding that you know tennis would the best parts about tennis is that it really is a lifetime sport. And that term gets thrown around a lot, but it really is, I think, as much as maybe any other sport where, people can play up to their 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. I mean, there's no reason, sure, injuries can slow people down, but there are certainly people playing up until their later years. So, if a parent can have the perspective that, not only is my child learning this lifetime sport that they can take with them for hopefully the rest of their life, but through this vehicle of tennis and sport, that they're hopefully learning these other important skills of hard work, of dedication, of resilience, how to win, how to lose. the list goes on and on. So understanding that, having that sort of perspective, but also being patient, being understanding with where they're at. And maybe their child did not have a good day out there. Maybe they tanked. Maybe they threw a racket. Maybe they were swearing or destroyed a racket, right? I mean, we recently talked about Federer, right? And he is famous for, as a kid and I think even early in his professional career being, having outbursts. And, I think we can think about most of the top players and have had maybe moments on big stages where they've had outbursts or haven't been at their best emotionally. Um, but, I think having compassion when dealing with um, people of that age and everybody and as well as ourselves um, go helps us and gets us a lot further than being overly judgmental and critical and sort of going back to those default states that we talked about.
And it's going to just promote more well-being in the individual. There's such a focus these days on mental illness, and self-compassion is people who are more self-compassionate have better outcomes when we're talking about subjective well-being. And so it's a really important feature of living a healthy and meaningful and fulfilling life, whether that life involves tennis for your junior player or not. They may do something after college. There's probably going to put a lot of effort and energy into that. Do we want them to be super critical and negative all the time and suffering with what's going on? Or would you like to help them through the sport of tennis develop this skill of knowing how to talk to themselves properly and to be kind to themselves and compassionate so that they can stay focused on what's important to them, that they can handle things that come at them much, much better. So whether you're going to be a tennis is your main thing, you want to be a pro, that's great. Also realize that you may not peak physically until you're 23 to 25. So we don't need to be so hyped up about 15, 16, really, right? It's a long, long path. But many of us will transition to something else, and maybe tennis takes a back seat. Although, as we've seen with a lot of pros, you can play. I mean, all the training and the nutrition stuff is really helping players to play at a high level later and later into life. And I see this even with some of the people I play with that, I'm in my 50s. I play with some guys who are also in their 50s. They don't look like they're in their 50s. They move great. They're strong. And there are a lot of those people out there. We can be them as well. Um, and I think compassion is a big part of how you maintain this love of the sport also, because I'm sure you've heard this, Josh, and many players will quit. Maybe their college experience wasn't so positive. Um, and that's not a great story. But part of it can also be, if that coach and that environment wasn't positive, then you're probably going to find it difficult to be positive with yourself. And then that just sort of spirals. So um, to me, this is a really important topic. It might be one that certain players or people listening to will find it difficult to be kind and compassionate to themselves. And that's probably true. But I think what we've tried to do today is to give some perspectives on why. And I think you're bringing up the whole idea of why you play is really important, keeping that in mind. And I think we've tried to bring some perspectives as to how one could cultivate that, and that we believe it's a really important aspect of being mentally tough out on the tennis court. And if you can do it, I think you'll see improvement. So, any last points for you, Josh?
Um, Maybe one last point that we didn't touch on, but I think it is an important point. I know we've talked about it in the past, is gratitude. Being grateful for being out there in the first place, being grateful for your physical abilities to be able to play a sport, being grateful to have the time to be able to be out there or be able to compete and continue, honing your game. So I think, if you can connect to that feeling of gratitude, also that's, in a certain way, a connected feeling or sort of emotion. But that's I think the one piece that we didn't touch on today, but it is certainly an important piece. And again, when it comes to well-being, gratitude is certainly linked with increased well-being. So if you can sort of connect to a greater feeling of being grateful and appreciative, it helps you handle those ups and downs. It helps you handle, okay, I just played a tournament and that really did not go well. Well, I'm grateful that I was able to play this tournament, grateful that, I'm able to compete, able that I'm healthy enough to be able to be out there and that I have more opportunities ahead of me.
That reminds me, and I'll end on this, is because I think that's right, and we're talking about the positive emotions that can help us lead happier, more fulfilling lives. A great book for people to look for is called The How of Happiness by Sonia Lubomirsky. Lots of great research, evidence-based interventions for developing more positive emotions in your life. Gratitude certainly being one of them. That's one of the bigger aspects of the book. And I think it goes well with what you just said and toward that well-being piece, right? So, Josh, great conversation today. Thanks for engaging on this topic, and thank you for listening. For more on today's episode, please check out the show notes. If you have any feedback or questions for me and Josh, please email us at tennisiqpodcast@gmail.com. You can also use the Twitter hashtag tennisiq. Additionally, please subscribe to the podcast on your podcast platform of choice, including YouTube, so you can be notified of new episodes. You can also check us out on Instagram. Thanks again, and we'll talk to you soon in our next episode.